Now, this, understand, please, is a continuation, the third in a series of 4 seminars on Mahayana Buddhism. And I try, as far as possible, to make each seminar self-contained, so that if you miss the ones that went before, you don't find what's being said completely unintelligible. But what we're going to take up this time, under the title The Net of Jewels, is the most, I would say, advanced and mature form of Mahayana Buddhism, which is known in Japan as Kegon, K-E-G-O-N, and in China as Huayan, H-U-A-Y-E-N, and in Sanskrit as Avatamsaka, A-V-A-T-A-M-S-A-K-A. And these words all mean the doctrine of the garland, of the garland, the wreath of flowers. And this was an attempt to make a synthesis of all Mahayana Buddhist doctrines, and including also the southern school, the Hinayana or Theravada, so as to show that all these points of view were consistent with each other, although apparently conflicting. It was perfected by a Chinese gentleman by the name of Fatsang, F-A-T-S-A-N-G, who died in 712 A.D., a man of absolutely extraordinary genius. It's curious that he's a contemporary of Huineng, the 6th patriarch of the Zen sect, who died in 713, a year later. You might say, in a way, of course, that the doctrine of Kegon is the intellectual content of Zen, because all Zen people, insofar as they have any intellectual interests in Buddhism, study the Kegon doctrine. And one of the patriarchs of the Kegon school, known as Shumitsu, was a patriarch of both schools. He lived in the Tang dynasty, rather later than Fatsang. Now, let me remind you of one thing, that Mahayana Buddhists don't have the same attitude to historical events that Christians do. For both Jews and Christians, history is enormously important. And the fact that Jesus did in fact live at a certain time, and that he taught thus and so, is considered immensely important. And therefore all Christians tend to want to find out what Jesus really did teach and go back to the original sources. It will forever be impossible to find out what the Buddha really did teach. It is hopelessly overlaid, and that nobody could ever figure it out. Besides, the Hindus have absolutely no sense of history whatsoever. It's impossible to date the great manuscripts of Hindu tradition. And scholars have the wildest wide variations in their guesses as, say, to the date of the Bhagavad Gita, or anything like that. You've got a generally attested assumption that the Buddha lived shortly after 600 BC, and that somewhere in the succeeding years, let's say, well, by about 200 BC, the Pali texts called the Pitakas, the 3 baskets of the doctrine, had been formulated, probably. But nobody really knows. But then you see we have a whole succession of sutras which represent the various points of view of the Mahayana, which may have been written, or we might say forged, anywhere from 100 BC to 500 AD. Many of them don't exist in the original Sanskrit. We only have them in Chinese or Tibetan translations. And here is why everything is so vague. The Mahayana theory is, you see, that when the Buddha first attained his liberation, he preached the complete inner Mahayana doctrine. But nobody could understand it. So he had to come down a step and preach something for simple people. Well, this sort of thing went on. He had a deep doctrine and a simple doctrine. But as time passed, those monks who had treasured the original records of the deep doctrine released them. And so the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is a whopper of a thing, very, very subtle, appears to be in circulation roughly about 450 AD. Goodness only knows where it came from. Nobody can possibly tell. It was simply found. It was revealed. And in the same way, of course, let's take the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy purports to be by Moses, although it describes Moses' own death. It was, as a matter of fact, unearthed in the year 621 BC, when, as a matter of fact, it was written, because it reflects opinions and attitudes of that time, but naturally it had to be attributed to Moses. And this was not because the author of Deuteronomy was a fraud intentionally, but because he was modest. If you expound the law, you must not do so in your own name. That would be very, very cocky. You must attribute it to Moses, because Moses is the archetype of all law. So in exactly the same way, when you have very profound ideas of your own, but nevertheless you feel that you got them from a depth of consciousness which was deeper than your ego, you call that depth of consciousness, that level, the Buddha. And so naturally you attribute it to the Buddha. I must, however, explain that there are many senses in which the word Buddha is used in Mahayana Buddhists, among Mahayana Buddhists. It is used as the title of the historic Gautama Siddhartha, who we know as the Buddha, Sakyamuni, which means the sage of the Sakya clan. But then in the Lotus Sutra, which I was discussing last week, the Buddha explains that his appearance as Shakyamuni after 600 BC was a mere sort of illusion. It was an upaya, that is to say, skillful means for helping sentient beings, because the true, actual Buddha is eternal and manifests itself again and again and again in myriad universes. And so you see these glorious Tibetan and Japanese mandala paintings where you have a central Buddha surrounded with Buddhalets. You find, for example, Kannon, the temple of Sanju Sangendo in Kyoto, where there are 1,001 figures of Kannon, all in gold. And each one of them has 11 heads. The main head that you see from the front, and then one on each side, looking this way, one behind, looking back, and then a pile of little heads on top, all the heads being different aspects of Buddha. The center figure has 1,000 arms, literally, all in carved wood, lacquered in gold. It's the most astonishing sight. You wonder what this is, and you are reminded of Argus with his many eyes, of some sort of cosmic centipede, or sea urchin, or something of this kind, with tentacles all over the place. So, this point then is that behind the historic Buddha, it is worked out there are the eternal Buddha. But this eternal Buddha is diversified in many different ways. So the evolved doctrine of Mahayana, which is connected with this Kiergon doctrine, is that there is at the center what is called Mahavairocana Buddha, which means the great sun Buddha. In Japanese, Dainichi Nyorai. And this great sun Buddha has some interesting historical origins, because one suspects that it comes from Persia and is some form of Ahura Mazda, the great sun, the great light. Nobody knows, but there it is.